Hi, I'm John Tain. I am here for the Lahore Biennale, and I am originally based in Hong Kong. So I first learned about Lahore Biennale Foundation while I was at Asia Art Archive, and Kutia Rahim, who's the director of the Biennale Foundation, had gotten in touch with us about projects that we could work on together. And then in 2020, I visited the second edition of the Lahore Biennale, which was curated by Hora Kasmi. So, well, for not just the foreign artists, for all of the artists, I think, one of the things I was really interested in was finding artists who matched up with the theme of ecologies and sustainabilities, but also who I felt like really could make a contribution and connect with the artists here and the local community here. And so I think a lot of the artists we work with, either they are doing things with local producers and fabricators and craftspeople, or else they have a project which is really speaking to a specific kind of theme or subject matter that is of relevance to people here. So it was actually came about because the initial conversations for the Lahore Biennale, the third edition, should have taken place in 2022. But of course there was a pandemic, and then there was the floods. And so I think when we were having these conversations, the floods were still very much in people's minds. And I think it wasn't so much a choice, it was kind of like an imperative. Like we had to really be thinking about, well, what does it mean to be doing a Biennale at this moment in time, given what's happened? And I think that the decision was made was it had to, in some ways, be reflective of that situation and think about ecologies and sustainabilities and address them. But I think that more specifically how it evolved was I didn't want it to be just a kind of a generic, oh, here are some artists who make work about climate or ecology from anywhere in the world, and then let's just like import them here and then that's it. I think it was really, for me, thinking about how these topics would be relevant for Lahore and for Pakistan. Well, I think that one of the things that I was really interested in was finding artists who would resonate with the communities here. And I think that what I wanted to also do was to not flatten it into a Pakistani versus like international or foreign. I wanted to complicate that, so like for instance, there are artists who are Pakistani but diasporic. There are artists who are non-Pakistani but who are working with Pakistani collaborators on their projects, or thinking about diasporic Pakistani communities, or even within Pakistan, understanding the multiplicity of Pakistan itself. So it's not just Punjabi, or it's not just like, oh, Sindhi. It's also understanding there's like Baloch, there's also like, there's different parts to the country, and each of those regions, each of those provinces has its own characteristics and has its own issues. Sometimes it's very easy. Some of the artists, I tell them about a site, or they came and did a site visit, and we all agree, this is the place for you. Sometimes they need more suggestions, like, oh, how about this place, or how about that place? And sometimes it's kind of a negotiation, like, there was a site that we were really kind of really hoping to be able to use, but in the end it turned out to be impossible just because there were structural issues with the building itself. And then so we had to move everyone to a different site, and that was like really kind of wrenching, because like we were so like, everyone was just so like, oh my god, this site is so amazing, we're gonna like do such great work. But in the end, I think it'll be fine. And it's kind of understanding what you can do with a place, but not maybe being too fixed or attached to it, like just being able to roll with things. Because like also one of the things about working in public sites is that because you're working with someone else's space, you're always like dependent on their availability. If like for whatever reason it's like, oh, you know what, we need to do this with this space, then what are you going to do? You can't be like, Well, I think it's really interesting. In some ways, Lahore reminds me of a lot of Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, because in the US, LA has a reputation as being a city where there's a lot of artists, and it's like an artist kind of city. But for a lot of its history, it didn't have much of an infrastructure. Like it had, maybe one or two art museums, and not so many galleries, and artists didn't generally sell. They were artists because they wanted to be artists, and then if they had to be teachers, or if they had to be special effects people, or if they had to work in advertising to so that they could be an artist, that's what they did. And I feel like Lahore is very similar in that it's a place that's full of creative people, and a lot of artists, people who studied or trained to be artists and who have that background, but who aren't necessarily in it because they think, oh, I'm going to become super rich, or this is how I'm going to make it big, or anything like that. They do it because they're passionate about it. And I think that's really an amazing thing about the city, is that there are a lot of people who are really committed to art, not for anything other than because they really are into art. I think one big difference between Lahore and LA is that this is also a city which has, a really long history of culture. And so, I think, if you think about the NCA, which was, until maybe 20 years ago, the only art school that, that was around, right? But that's an art school that extends back to the 1800s, right? 1860s. And so I think that, that history is an interesting one, and it's been this kind of dialogue between, different traditions and different practices that has really informed the scene here. And so that's interesting to see, in the way that, what people consider art, and the way that it does and doesn't intersect with the global art world. I am working on a couple of writing projects and editing, publishing projects, and also, a few other programming projects. But otherwise, actually, this was my chance to kind of really just focus on this, and then afterwards we'll see.